kick off then. And a second welcome to everybody who's participating in this panel discussion. One of the objectives of Amcham is to network, and this is one of the facilities to do so, but also the content of the webinar is really to expand the thought leadership amongst our members in our business community. So welcome to you all. And particularly to the panelists, Glennie, who's the founder and director of the Tears Foundation, Tanya Mulligan, who's a partner at CHM Attorneys, and Tom Hamilton, who's CEO of the Kyle Army Schools Group. I think I'm particularly pleased Tom's here. He came to South Africa 37 years ago on a gap year, and amazing how time flies, and he just forgot to count the time, and he's still here. So it's fantastic to have you here. If one is to perhaps summarize the draft code of good practice on the elimination of violence and harassment, it breaks down into three components. The first one is a description of expanded description of harassment in its various forms. The second part is policies and procedures on the part of employers, and then thirdly, how to deal with incidents of harassment and in particular investigations and supporting the victims. So what Tanya will be doing is really talking to the architecture of this draft code, and then Tom and Mara are going to talk about the investigations and the healing processes that are so important for victims. Tom will talk about bullying in schools, and if harassment in really its most general form involves bullying of some sort, and more than often than not, there's an abuse of power, or it really seriously impairs the dignity of the individuals. And then Mara will look at the sexual harassment and the work that her foundation is doing in this regard, and there's really good work, but in a way frightening work. And I'll ask them in a moment to introduce themselves. But just by way of introduction, I think if we do have an environment that is free of violence and harassment, that has positive effects both on investment decisions and also the productivity and engagement and wellness of employees. And the converse also applies. Now, with the amendments not only brought about through the code or the new fields of obligations on the part of employers, but also other amendments to the Employment Equity Act, there are serious consequences for non-compliance or failure properly to comply with the new code, and there is both vicarious liability claims on the part of the employer, or being disqualified from state tenders, and one would like to position adherence to the code more than a compliance issue. It's really, I think, at the end of the day, about investment in the welfare and the well-being of employees. And I think both what Tom and Mara will talk to is that harassment can have really serious negative consequences for victims, and it's just not a hostile environment that they experience in the workplace, but it can have life-changing experiences, and we really don't want to visit those on our fellow colleagues in the workplace. I think this is a draft code, so it's not finalized yet. It is going through the NEDBLAC, and then we'll have to go through the parliamentary processes, and will be published for public comment. So, Tanya, I don't know if you've got a timeline on when it might be promulgated, but what, end of the year, beginning of next year?
Yeah, we are still uncertain at this point. I understand that it's imminent, and there's a lot of pressure being put to implement it as rather sooner than later, but the exact date I'm not sure of.
Yeah, and I think what it does, it gives us a window of opportunity to come up to speed with the requirements, and in particular the awareness and training of employees. Please use the chat box. Annika will monitor that for us. Ask questions at any stage. Just raise your hand, and again, Annika will indicate who's raised the hand. I might not be able to see that. Tanya is here until 1 o'clock, so if there are questions that you would like to put to her, please use the timeline in that regard. So Tanya will kick off, and then Tom, and then Mara. Any questions or any thoughts before we kick off? Anybody got any issues? We all comfortable, all tuned in? Okay, super. Tanya, are you ready? Oh, no, I must do the introductions. Yeah, Tanya, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, guys. My name is Tanya Mulligan, as Mike has said. I'm a partner in the Employment Law Department of Cowan Harper Medicazelo Attorneys.
Yeah.
What else would you like to know?
Just the area that you're most interested in, and in terms of employment law.
Yeah, look, we do a variety of employment law, but obviously discrimination law is one of the main areas that I like to focus in. Yeah, so, but I do all employment law. It's such a wide field. Yeah.
Yeah. Super. Well, welcome, Tanya. Yeah. Mara.
Yes. Hello. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to be here today. I'm the founder of Tears. I've been running Tears for 10 years. Every year we help take on the recipients of calls or verbally speak to approximately 150,000 people. That's a lot of calls because gender-based violence and problems with that are really huge in our country. So I'm really looking forward to sharing with you all.
Yeah, super. And I think to all the participants, one of the big questions is how can employers adequately support victims, and the Tears Foundation is one of the portals that you can tap into. So great to have you here. Yeah, Tom.
Thanks very much, Mike, and great to be with the panel. Tom Hamilton, as Mike mentioned, originally from Ireland, been in South Africa a long time, and obviously has seen the country grow as it became a democracy, new constitution, and those principles being implemented in schools, and have been leading in schools for over 2 decades and seeking, I think, to implement best practice and also to bring in principles of restorative justice in our schools. And in South African schools, that has not been necessarily part of the history or heritage in the educational sector. Thanks very much.
Yeah, super, Tom, and we look forward to all of you. All right, Tanya, if I can kick off, with you, if in a nutshell, what is contained in the new code?
So the new code contains a lot of new definitions of harassment, and it has broadened the scope of it quite substantially. It now introduces bullying and cyberbullying, which we have seen to become more prevalent. Interestingly enough, it has included passive-aggressive harassment. For example, condescending eye contact, which I think, it's very interesting that it is expanded so far to go to that, because this is very subtle forms of harassment which employers they don't always pick up. Mobbing has been introduced. The tests for harassment has also been included, and it has placed a lot of emphasis on an employer's obligation to train the employees on what constitutes harassment, which is really good news for us. It also sets out quite nicely the procedure to be followed by employers in case of harassment.
Oh, super. And I think it's so well that you highlighted just at the beginning there, Tanya, that it's not just what is said or done, but how it is done. And I think that brings in that passive-aggressive component to it. And Tanya, what are the overall objectives of the code? What are they trying to achieve here?
Well, they're trying to eliminate harassment and the prevention of it. Again, they are really, really pushing for the implementation of policies, harassment policies and procedures to appropriately deal with harassment in the workplace. You need to create a workplace that is free from harassment, where employees respect each other's integrity, dignity, right to privacy and equality. Yeah.
Super. And I think it's, so much of employment law tells people what not to do, and we list offences. And I think the last sentence that you made there, that the whole objective here is to build respect, acknowledge integrity, dignity, and privacy, and the right to equality. If we can focus on the positive behaviours, I mean, that's really, really super. Tanya, if one looks at all of the labour legislation, the first issue that comes up, is there an employment relationship? So does this code just deal with those in employment, or does it go beyond that?
No, it goes quite widely past the employment relationship. It applies to employers, employees. Interestingly, they've included job applicants, which is a nice addition, clients, suppliers, customers. So an employer's obligation to ensure that its customers and suppliers are aware of its policies and the intention of how they are trying to prevent harassment. It's quite a nice addition to have included it and to have thrown the net a bit wider. Interestingly enough, the workplace has also been widened to quite substantially, and it now includes people working remotely, which we've seen has happened in the last, what has it been, 2 years? It feels like forever that we've been in COVID. But now the workplace is actually, your working from home is now your workplace, which is very interesting from an employment law perspective. Now, in the previous draft, we saw that they tried to introduce domestic violence into an employer's obligation. This has now been removed in the new code. But it gets one thinking to the extent of what are employers' obligation for someone working at home? To what extent do their policies, rules, and procedure, how would that extend to your own working environment? And I think we'll have to see what happens in due course and what the courts decide.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And so it's an expanded definition of the workplace. And then also the expanded role of stakeholders who can be both victims and perpetrators. You know, if you look at it, the whole range of, so it's not only harassment between employees or by the employer on the employer, but it's that wider stakeholder group, and that's particularly important. And Tanya, you know, some of the aspects of the Employment Equity Act place obligations on designated employers and other parts to all employers. To whom does this code apply?
Everyone. There's no exemptions. No one's been excluded. Whether you're a big company, small company, you need to comply with the code.
Yeah. And I mean, that presumably is subject, there are limitations given the size of the employer, in fact, or what they can potentially do. And I think the test here is what is reasonably practicable and what the employer can control. And I'm sure we'll come back to that again. How's harassment defined now in the new code?
It's quite nice. It was never defined in the Employment Equity Act, so it's nice that it has been defined now. What has been included in the definition is physical, psychological, and emotional abuse. Racial abuse has also been included, which is quite a nice addition. Now, you know, I think you'll all agree with me that harassment is more often than not psychological or emotional, which has made it very hard to identify. So it's nice that the code has been expanded to include it.
Oh, super. And, you know, with harassment, are there some sort of telltale signs or indicators that point to harassment? I mean, how's it dealt with?
Yeah, look, if you look at the common characteristics of harassment, it's defined as unwanted conduct, which is persistent or serious. So it can either be continuous harassment, or if it's serious enough, once is enough to qualify as harassment. That creates a hostile and intimidating working environment and relates to one of the prohibited grounds in terms of Section 6 of the Employment Equity Act. Now, the unwarranted element is very important, and the question then becomes whether the person knew that the conduct was unwanted or ought to have known. And I think that, again, ties up quite nicely with an employer's obligation to do training, to have policies and procedures, and to create awareness, because a lot of times in practice you'll find that the first excuse of a perpetrator would be, well, I didn't know that's offensive. I didn't know this would make her uncomfortable. But they ought to have known. So I think the training will go a far way in ensuring that people don't use excuses of ignorance.
Yeah, super. And I think if one was just to take those four elements that you've described, the unwanted conduct, the consequence of a hostile environment, and the individual should have, knew or should have known. And those are, quick back of a cigarette box, if that's still polite to refer to. And just the general test for harassment, has it occurred? What are those frameworks? Is it a subjective, objective test?
It's very strange. It says it's an objective test from the perspective of the victim. To be honest with you, I'm not too sure what that means. I assume it says the employer must make sure that place itself in an objective view from the victim. So it clearly has a subjective element to it, but the employer has to ensure that the employee is not overly sensitive. I think this definition could or the test for it could be problematic, and we'll have to find out exactly how the courts interpret it, but mostly objective. Interestingly, the state of mind of the perpetrator is not necessary or looked at in order to establish harassment. What the intentions was when they acted is really irrelevant. The only time one looks at the intention would be when one looks at the disciplinary inquiry and one looks at a sanction that needs to be imposed on the perpetrator. But other than that, it doesn't affect the fact that it does constitute harassment.
Yeah, super. And I know, Mara, we'll talk more about the impact of how the individual feels and that objective subjective stuff. So look forward to that input from you later on, Mara. And just looking at if we did get it all wrong, the negative impacts of harassment in the workplace.
Look, obviously, it will create a hostile working environment, and it negatively affects an employee's ability to do their work. I think we can all agree that if your workforce is unhappy, if there's a hostile or toxic working environment, your business will suffer.
Yeah, and I think also something that is very prevalent, and Tom will chat about it, the incidents can escalate tremendously into the public domain, and schools have certainly seen that with press and politicians knocking on the doors, and then in a traditional employment sense, it escalates into collective action or strike action on the part of employees. When harassment happens in the workplace, how does this impact on what the employer should do, or what should the employer do in terms of the code and the act?
Look, in terms of the code, it puts a lot of emphasis on the employer has to be proactive and anticipate the potential of abuse, and thereafter take reasonable steps in order to protect employees from this kind of abuse. Interestingly enough, it's quite a strange provision, but it states that an employer will create a hostile working environment where it should have anticipated that employees would be subject to abuse, but failed to take reasonable steps to protect them from that. Now, I think an example of that would be, when does an employer anticipate that abuse would occur? Now, the example that I can think of is if you have a bar, for example, and there's a lot of alcohol involved, an employer should, in those circumstances, anticipate that there would be abuse, and for that reason, they should put extra steps in place in order to prevent it. But yes, it's very interesting that they've included this.
Yeah. So I think what you're highlighting there is the importance of employers doing a risk assessment of what is the exposure, potential exposure, or the covert exposure to harassment. In the code that talks about direct or indirect harassment, how's this actually and I think that's just generally in Section 6 of the Act. It prohibits direct or indirect. But in the context of harassment, how does that play out, that distinction?
Well, obviously, direct is very obvious. It's targeted at a specific individual, so using abusive language or making any sort of sexual advances unwarranted to a specific person. Where indirect is more difficult. It undermines a person's dignity, but it is not direct. So, for example, social exclusion of certain races. I think the indirect or harassment or discrimination is very difficult for us and for employers to determine, because it's not obvious, and one really has to look carefully in order to identify it.
Yeah, and I think it just really highlights the importance around the use of language and behaviour and actions on the part of it. And just some examples of the expanded definition of harassment. What are we talking about under the code?
They've included slandering, malicious rumors, conduct that humiliates, deliberate impeding performance, ostracizing, exclusions, intolerance towards personal circumstances, certain forms of surveillance of employees, and pressurizing employees to resign. It's only some of them, but yes, there's been quite a few, which is quite nice.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that really teases us of looking at a whole wide range of practices in the workplace and incidents. I think we'll find a lot of employers may have to really change their behavior. If you think of things like abuse of disciplinary processes against employees would fall under that. And just to link being under the Employment Equity Act, it's these activities, but they've got to relate to one of the prohibited ground. How does that nexus occur, and how relevant, and what's the importance of that?
So Section 6.3 of the Employment Equity Act states that harassment of an employee is a form of unfair discrimination and is prohibited in terms of grounds 6.1 or Section 6.1 of the Employment Equity Act. Now, Section 6.1 of the Employment Equity Act prohibits unfair discrimination based on race, gender, pregnancy, marital statements, ethnic, social origin, and the list continues. So they have a whole bunch of prohibited grounds, but there's kind of a catch-all clause at the end of it to say any other arbitrary ground. So a lot of the harassment we'll see will probably fall into that category, but not all harassment will be discriminatory. But it nevertheless amounts to misconduct. It still remains harassment. It might just not qualify as being discrimination.
Okay, super. I think just to jump a little bit ahead in terms and look at the specific section relating to racial, ethnic or social origin harassment, and they list examples here such as abusive language, racially offensive written material or visual material, racist name calling, open hostility on basis of race or ethnic group, subtle or blatant exclusion or threatening behavior, and quite extensive that. And ultimately, what is the test used whether racial harassment has happened or not?
It's objectively assessed with reference to the reaction of the normal or reasonable person in line with constitutional values. Now, it's very difficult again. Now, they say on a balance of probabilities, is the conduct related to race? And this is very difficult to establish. A lot of times it's not very direct. It's not direct racial statements. A lot of times quite neutral statements are made. And I think those are the circumstances where it becomes difficult for employers to identify it. Now, I don't know if you remember the case of Rustenburg Platinum Mines versus Bester.
Yeah, I think let's just share that again with us because it is such an important case. It went through to the Constitutional Court. Briefly, what are the facts there, Tanya? Tanya, have you gone offline? Something's happened to Tanya. Tanya, perhaps if you can dial out and come back in again. Annika, won't you send I've got a note. Let me just bear with me and let me just send a note to Tanya.
No problem, Mark. I see she has frozen, so she might have lost signal.
Yeah. Yeah, she's gone out. Yeah, okay.
Sorry, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can, Tanya. Yeah, thanks very much.
I'm so sorry. The power just all went off, so I'm sorry, but I'm back.
Okay. Yeah, well done. Yeah. You were just chatting. We're going to chat about the Bester case.
Yes, sorry. So in Rustenburg Platinum Mines versus Bester, Bester used the term Swartman, which, objectively there was a lot of debate. I mean, this case went from the CCMA to the Labour Court to the Labour Appeal Court and ultimately to the Constitutional Court. Now, they had to determine whether this seemingly neutral statement of describing someone as Swartman was racist or not. Now, the Labour Appeal Court found that it was not racist. It was only used as a way to describe a person whose name you did not know. The Constitutional Court had a different view of this. They said that, yes, in order to determine whether there's racist conduct or not, you have to take an objective view. But the history of apartheid in our country must be taken into account, and for that reason, it was described as racist conduct. So, from all of this, I think you'll agree with me that it's quite difficult to establish when a neutral statement actually constitutes racism or racial harassment. But in terms of the code, the test that they've used, which I think is probably the best one, is to try and determine whether a person would have acted the same but for the race of a person. So in his normal behavior, would he have acted differently had the race been different? And I think, obviously that involves quite a wide-scale inquiry as to his normal conduct, how would he normally approach people, in order to determine whether there's any difference or not.
Yeah. And I think a little bit more of the case. Best could have said, can you ask the driver of that vehicle to move it? But he actually said, ask the black man to remove his car, and it's got undertones to that statement. But I think what it does do, or highlight, and what you have highlighted here, Tanya, is the big challenge that employers will have if you go the disciplinary route. And really demonstrate, and perhaps at times the restorative justice approach might be more effective, and Tom will chat to that later. And where harassment has been brought to the attention of the employer, you did touch on earlier some of the obligations that the employer must do, but perhaps you could just expand on that, of obviously taking action, and what more should they be doing?
Yeah, so Section 60 of the Employment Equity Act is obviously one of the big things for employers, because that states that once an allegation has been made that an employee has contravened the provisions of the Employment Equity Act, the employer must consult all relevant parties and take necessary steps in order to eliminate the alleged conduct in terms of the provisions of the Act. Now, that's more of a remedy or a cure, but apart from that, employers must be proactive. And I think if employers aren't proactive, they're going to always just do damage control, which is really no good. They must implement a harassment policy, and critically, the contents must be explained and communicated to employees so that they understand it. More so, they must seek to create an environment where employees are where the employees feel free to raise any grievances about harassment without any fear of retaliation. Now, just in summary, I'm jumping back to Section 60. In terms of the legislation, an employer must consult all relevant parties, take necessary steps in terms of its policy and the code, and then eliminate the harassment. Obviously, it's a big obligation on employers, and they must really do an investigation, and a proper investigation, to get to the bottom of it.
Okay, super. And I think what one's looking at the end of the day is it's an exercise in change management, and one of the successful steps in affecting change in organization is to really build an understanding and explain the rationale behind a policy and a procedure. But in addition to that, what are the broad contents that would go into a procedure?
So it's very interesting. The code actually gives quite a few examples that must be put into a harassment policy. So it actually has gone as far to say the following clauses must be included. It's frightening for me as a person and a labor law attorney to think that we have to tell people not to harass other people, and you have to expressly say that. It's astounding, but nevertheless, in terms of the policy and the code, you have to state, please refrain from harassing other people. You should state that the harassment is prohibited, that it constitutes unfair discrimination, which infringes the rights of the complainant and constitutes a barrier to equality in the workplace. It should also set out the specific procedures to follow. And I think also, state that retaliation against an employee who lodges a complaint in good faith will be a disciplinary offence, because I think obviously there would be a lot of hesitation and from people or victims to lodge a complaint, because if it's your boss, if it's someone high in the organization, it could be very career limiting if the right procedures and protection is not put in place.
Yeah. Super. So I think really building up understanding around why we're introducing it, and then further than that, can we just put up a policy on the notice board? Will that suffice, or do we have to do something more, Tanya?
No. Look, it's much more than that. It is awareness training and communication to employees. You must make sure that they have read it, that they understand it, and understand the implications of it. The fact that they can't victimize, what victimization entails, and that the victim should be protected. I think it's continuous training on this aspect and on the policy.
Yeah, super. And I think what it does highlight again is, I mentioned it earlier, the importance of doing the risk assessment. What is the incidence and the potential here? And then also to highlight the very negative consequences that can flow from it, and kind of build up understanding that this is not just about name calling. It can actually fundamentally change people's lives. Under the Employment Equity Act, there is also an obligation on employees who are confronted with harassment. And what does the Act say, and how practical is that task for the individual?
Yes, the Act is very strange. It says that the alleged contravention of the Employment Equity Act should be brought to the employer's attention immediately. Now, that word immediately has been subject to, believe it or not, to quite a few court decisions. What does that mean? Does their obligation, is it less if it's not reported immediately? And the courts have found that the word immediately should not be interpreted literally, because cognizance must be taken of the fact that employees will be hesitant to raise their complaints, and it might take some time for them to actually build up the courage, or to muster up the courage to bring it to the attention of the employer. So that word immediately is really not relevant. But yes, once it is reported, the employer should assist the employees, and particularly because they might be hesitant, to keep it as confidential as possible. Now, if one looks, I'm sure you'll go into the sexual harassment or racial harassment. It's a very sensitive and very close to someone. For that reason, they should ensure that employees know that or victims know that once a complaint is made, it will be kept confidential. Only the participants who need to be directly involved will know about the process, and only they will participate in any inquiry or grievance that is scheduled.
Yeah, super. And I think we'll touch on that with Tom as well, where the issue falls into the public domain and third parties get involved, and how one balances out that the intent that you've just described, or the purpose, and with that broader issues. Once an employer set out a policy and procedures, are those just guidelines and indicators, or to what extent does the employer have to support and resource that policy?
Look, generally from an employment law perspective, any policy that employers would implement is normally a guideline. We normally tell our clients that do it as a guideline, so you're not bound by it. But in the case of harassment, it's slightly different. Now, because of Section 60, it says that an employer must take appropriate steps once they become aware of harassment. Now, a recent case is the Liberty Group case versus M. It's a Labour Appeal Court case. And in this case, the court had to determine whether Liberty took appropriate steps once it became aware of the violation of the Employment Equity Act. And in this case, a lot of emphasis was placed on the employer's failure to act in terms of its own policy. And because the employer did not act in terms of its own policy and procedure, they found that it did not take the adequate or appropriate steps in dealing with the matter. In this case, Liberty was ordered to pay damages in the amount of about 250,000. So yes, I think in the case of harassment, it's slightly different, and employers should make sure that they comply with their own policies and procedures as well as the code.
Yeah. Okay, and I think what this does, or that places obligation really on all the stakeholders, is to, when you design the policy and the procedures, spend time saying, how's this actually going to work in practice? And look at the possible pitfalls that may come up in that regard. I think we've touched earlier on the consequences of non-compliance, and in particular, I think now the disqualification to bid for or carry out state contracts. And I think, Tanya, I think the going back some years ago where the employer really messed up on a sexual harassment claim, and I think it was one of the newspaper groups, and really the impact was terribly destructive on the victim or the complainant, and I think they were obliged then, and it goes back some years ago, the damages there were R1 million. So really mess it up can have significant financial and reputational consequences for the employer. I think Mara will certainly chat to some of the debilitating effects of sexual harassment on individuals and the support that they need. But just from a very basic employment perspective of what about sick leave and flexibility with regard to sick leave? What does the code tell us there?
So in the case of your normal harassment, your sick leave as normal would apply. You know, if you get a doctor's note, you can be booked off, and you know it will be in terms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. It's quite a nice addition to the code that it has put in to say that employers should attempt to give additional sick leave in cases where there's serious harassment, because obviously the extent of the harassment, the extent of the emotional trauma that this person may feel, they might require a longer period to go for counselling and to go and heal from the experience. So it does encourage employers to extend the sick leave. It's however not an obligation in terms of the code.
Yeah, super. And I think just looking at the options of employers in terms of steps to be taken in cases where there has been harassment, and it'll all be circumstance dependent and situation dependent, but it will carry all the way from warnings through to dismissals, transfers, counselling, training, etc. But just to conclude then with two other questions, Tanya, the remedies aren't available to a victim, are not restricted to employment law. There are probably other remedies available. Could you briefly touch on those?
No, look, obviously, they keep their remedies under their civil remedies. So depending on the nature of the harassment, whether it was slanderous, I mean, they can claim damages from a civil perspective. To the extent PUTA might also come into play if it was in respect of someone who wasn't an employee. So there's a variety of civil remedies, and also criminal, obviously, if one's violence is introduced, or any physical conduct. So, it goes much wider than from an employment law perspective.
Oh, super. And then just perhaps to deviate a little bit away from the line of thought that you've been having, relationships do develop in the workplace, and they do become intimate. And where you've got two employees who have a consensual relationship in the workplace, any advice to them or to employers in this regard?
Look, we have had a couple of those cases, and it's very difficult because, especially with the younger groups, one minute they love each other and it's all great, and the next moment there's claims of sexual harassment being made, or the one party breaks it off and now it's no longer wanted, it's unwanted conduct or attention. So it becomes very difficult for an employer to deal with. We recommend that what they call, I think it's more of an American term, love contracts be concluded, and that is where the employer says, as a rule, no romantic relationships may take place at the workplace. It's completely prohibited. However, should you come and disclose it to us and sign the necessary documents to show we are in a relationship, I think it also tries to avoid flings that would normally happen at year-end functions, and tries to limit it to real substantial relationships that develop. That will obviously protect an employer from claims of unfair, while not taking the appropriate steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. So yeah, we do encourage that, but it's a difficult thing because I don't think a lot of time employees are quite open to go and discuss their romantic relationships with their employer. However, if they fail to do so, it's misconduct in terms of their employment contract.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thanks for that. And I think what it is really is putting things into an open perspective, avoiding some of the pitfalls of intimate relationships in the workplace, as you've you've indicated. So really super advice. The strange term, love contract. But nonetheless, any questions to Tanya? She does have to excuse herself in 15 minutes. But any questions from the group or the participants in the webinar? Okay, well, let's move on then to Tanya. Thanks so much. It's a huge amount of territory that you've covered, and you've done it very succinctly, and I think built up an understanding. So thanks very much indeed for that. So we'll move on to Tom as our next participant. I think bullying in schools has been an ongoing process, and I think it's all the more difficult for employers, for schools, because of the turnover of pupils and parents. Yeah, there's a constant mix of people and new ones coming in, and what that does highlight is there's no quick fix. It's an ongoing, task. If we just look at two aspects of harassment, and in the context of the schools, that harassment is included in the definition of harassment is verbal bullying, and that's threats, shaming, hostile teasing, insults, constant negative judgment or criticism, etc. And then under another heading, they've got other terms for harassment is bullying, the use of formal power, attempts to get leverage on the individual, and then as Tanya mentioned, that passive aggressive stuff, the invisible treatment. And then also cyber bullying, the online, bullying. Just I said in my introduction that I think almost all aspects of harassment involve bullying of some sort, and an abuse of power, and often an abuse of power, or an attempt to gain some influence or control over another person and get them to do things that they would not normally or naturally, do. So, Tom, I think just as a kickoff, when you look at the school environment, what impact does bullying have on a victim?
Mike, thank you. In a school environment, one is trying to help people of a young age, from perhaps preschool right through until 18, 19, to reach their potential and to provide a safe environment in which they can do that. And it would be true that if a person is diminished in any way, feels unsafe, is insecure, is not emotionally and socially safe, that their ability to achieve their full potential is reduced. There's no doubt about that. In addition to that, you'd have things like self-esteem and self-belief are diminished. Apart from the fact that just the dignity of people is not there, and every single school in our country would subscribe to the tenets of the Constitution, our national Constitution, and everyone has a right to dignity. So, self-belief damage, self-esteem damage, and limitations in terms of ability to reach potential, and that's a key thing for us, because without that safety, children just seem to underperform.
Yeah. And Tom, I think there have been many examples, I'm sure, in your school career where a person maybe 10, 20, 30 years after they left school will sit across your table as the head of the school and complain of bullying in their youth. In other words, the scars of actually never leave.
Oh, absolutely, Mike. I've got countless cases of that where young people have carried the pain and the hurt and the damage of bullying at school that went unchecked or unmediated or uncorrected. And it's gone through their lives with them. It's gone through to their 40s, 50s and 60s. And in some ways, I mean, I could relate examples of where I've gone through rituals where I've been unburdening people of the burden they've carried because of bullying that was allowed to take place in the schools in their youth.
Oh, super. And I think that for me, it's painful for the victims, but also to emphasize it to the stakeholders, the dramatic effects that this cruelty can have. Tom, just what is the role of leadership in combating bullying and harassment in the workplace?
Well, if we started first principles first, I mean, in a school environment, be it a nursery school, a prep school, or a secondary school, you might even go to tertiary if you wanted to. So much starts with the head, the leader. And I think if the principal of the school, the head of the school, and the senior management are at one, then you've got a chance to have a clear idea as to what is acceptable and what isn't within a school. And I suppose, again, operating within the national framework of our constitution, our schools should be places of social justice, human rights, democratic values, perhaps. And within that, in communities, you've got, you know, in our group at the moment, we've got 1,700 children and we've got 3,000 parents, let's say, or thereabouts, and probably another 2,000 alumni. Well, we've got 1,700 children. On any given day, when you put 2 or 3 children together, there's a chance that something is going to go wrong. So in that situation, continually emphasizing, as you said, because we renew ourselves every cycle, respect for others, treating people honestly, treating people fairly, showing courtesy, and upholding the dignity of others. These are all key principles that need to be spoken to and messaged pretty much weekly and daily within a school.
Oh. Tom, I think it's really emphasizing there that it's that feeling safe, feeling respected, and it's a critical part of our society. And obviously, race has a huge part to play given the history of our country. Tom, sort of moving on, what level of bullying happens in schools, and why does this happen?
Well, perhaps continuing on from where I was, I mean, adolescents are being formed or are forming themselves, and they do so in a social context, obviously. They also carry hurt and damage and influences from their home lives, broader social lives, and maybe community lives into their schools. So people are coming from different contexts and different positions all the time, and they project that, and their own insecurities can be projected in different ways in the school as well. So from that point of view, I think we could say that there's a continuum in any school community, be it a nursery school, a primary school, or a high school. There's a continuum of bullying and intimidation or maybe harassment that goes on any given day. And all schools lie on that continuum. It's either lesser or more. It's definitely never zero, because this goes on in any school. There is no perfect school where none of these apparent behaviors doesn't occur. So within that context, I think it's always useful for the leadership and for the staff and for senior students to appreciate that things are going wrong here today, without a doubt. And therefore, when we see things going wrong, let's take corrective action as far as possible. Let's be proactive if we can, etc. Let's emphasize the positive behaviors that we can all bring to our community engagement so that we eliminate or we dissipate or diminish the proportion, if you like, of bullying and outright negative behaviors that are happening. I'd like to think that most of our good schools want to be progressive, and that means that it's all about human relationships, isn't it? The positive side of human relationships.
Yeah. And I think an important remark there that you made of reinforcing positive behaviors. You know, we often omit those, and where it happens, let's acknowledge it and let's celebrate, that. Tom, I think a successful approach to dealing with bullying and harassment, likewise in the workplace, is the correlation between being able to detect bullying, to prevent it and to address it. And this is kind of a chicken and egg situation, because unless people bring it to your attention or one has been able to unearth it, just how does one go about detecting the forms of and incidents of bullying in organizations? I mean, it's your starting point to any successful policy and practice.
Yeah, a very good question. And I think it echoes some of the issues that Tanya was reflecting in the workplace as well. One of the things that I certainly personally don't enjoy is this idea that we've got a zero tolerance for anything in a school context, because zero tolerance means we don't deal with it. We kind of expiate it as opposed to find ways to overcome it and learn from it. So in that particular situation, I think detection and prevention are definitely interrelated. Also, bullying and victimhood in a psychological sense, are almost like flip sides of the same coin as well. And I think one always needs to try and create an environment where when somebody is being victimized or bullied, that it's safe for the bully, the victim, if you like, or the victim's friends and supporters, or those people who've just observed it, to be able to report. And in some ways, Mike, a zero tolerance policy kind of subverts that, because if the likely impact of reporting somebody for this particular infraction is that they may be thrown out, the loyalty within school communities sometimes then says, well, you can't report them for this. We have to find another way, if you like. So within that context, you'll hear a lot about the codes of silence that occurs in schools, where students will not responsibly report because they maybe don't trust the system. They don't like the history of outcomes that were there. Either the responses from management or the system was too draconian, or perhaps it was non-existent altogether. So therefore, sometimes students will find different ways to find it. And I think in that situation, we're saying here is that positively messaging to say reporting poor behavior and negative and destructive behaviors is in the best interest of our community always. Our approach will be one where we'll try and intervene in such a way that at the end of the day, all the protagonists are still here and everybody's wiser and we're all better off, if you know what I'm saying. So that there's a commitment to trying to fix the thing within the community as it exists, as opposed to we're going to find the perpetrators and we're going to chuck them out and we're going to make a big statement about how we don't tolerate this.
Yeah, super. And I think what you're highlighting there is the first priority is to protect the victims and to and see there are equal stakeholders, no more than equal stakeholders in the process, but to overcome that silence is absolutely critical, and that is partly the having positive experiences where it is reported, and I think setting out a policy of saying that all harassment is condemned and prohibited, and certainly will not be condoned, but don't make discipline the default remedy in the circumstances. Tom, just thinking about you talked about restorative justice approaches. Could you perhaps just outline what that entails and what is the objective here? And if it works well, what sort of outcomes do you see?
Yeah, it's restorative justice, I suppose, is the idea that everyone is inherently worthy and that our connection to one another and our relationships to one another is what happens, what matters most. And in many ways, restorative justice has become a kind of a buzz phrase, if you like. And in some ways, schools use it when they've had a massive crisis. I can think of schools that have been in the press recently where clearly there has to be a strong restorative framework in order to have any chance of coming through the trauma they've been through. But restorative justice actually, in its best sense, is a proactive approach to community behavior. It's one where the little things are encouraged, the positive aspects are encouraged on a day-to-day basis. The little nonsenses and infractions that perhaps could lead to something far more negative or worrisome are challenged before they become too serious. So that there's a sense of we create a framework or a network or a fabric of relationship. And within that, we will have trust, we will have relationship, and we will have respect. And then when you've got those underpinning kind of connectors, the chances of being able to overcome issues of perpetrator, victim, bully, victim, etc., the harasser and the person being harassed, it's probably you've got a higher chance of being able to restore things in a positive and a proactive sense from that point of view. It's hard work though, Mike. I mean, restorative justice it's not the simple answer. And certainly in school environments, where traditionally the quick and easy was. I mean, a generation ago or 2 generations ago, it was 6 of the best. We're a light years away from that now. And I suppose many people would like it to be the same because that seemed like it was sensible and simple and easy. Except, of course, when we look back 2 generations, 6 of the best never changed anything. They just made it feel like we were doing something to challenge the behavior. But the bullying still went on and the victims still went unsupported. And I think the restorative justice principles are, we need to get into this and understand why this behavior is happening and what each party can do to make sure that they prevent it happening in future, and also how each party can be affirmed going forward to help the whole community prevent it in future.
Yeah, super. I think what you're seeing, it's almost a holistic approach of healing the victim, educating the perpetrator, and having a restoration of the relationship, amongst them. And I think you've previously, described in our conversations that don't make the perpetrators become the victims of harassment themselves, rather make them ambassadors of the correct and appropriate behaviors. But I mean, that's hard work there, Tom. In your schools, do you have specialists who do this, or have you been able to train up people within the organization to conduct these processes?
Well, where I am now here at the Kyalami Schools Group, we're going through a huge inclusion drive. We are working very hard to make sure that every aspect of identity and sense of self is respected and protected. And that means that staff need to really be on the same wavelength, because it can't be done. Yes, I've said already, the head and the senior management have a powerful role to play, but it can't be imposed from the top. It's got to be a process of people walking the talk. So we started actually towards the end of last year and early this year with just looking at how student and teacher interactions go and the kind of things that teachers can say that may seem funny or maybe off the cuff, and yet actually are hurtful, maybe racist, maybe dismissive, etc., or non-inclusive. And we've got task teams that operate on all of these aspects. And again, as I say, it's hard work. And we've got measures and evaluation tools in place where we're able to assess whether that's improved. Our own internal processes are saying that from a staff student point of view, we're beginning to gain traction. However, within the student body itself, there's still a long way to go to make that possible.
Yeah. But certainly, I think you're describing huge energy that goes into it, a range of people and resources that will be available in dealing with it. And then also at the other side, you want to try and close the thing out expeditiously. And some of these things will take time. And once one embarks on it, you've got to resource it properly and allow that to happen. Tom, just to what I suppose one could look at bullying and harassment in a very broad sense, like an iceberg, that what's on the surface may not be reflective of what's underneath that. And kind of any lessons that we can learn from that's in the public domain around schools. I'm thinking of Pretoria Girls High and what happened there, and perhaps you can just remind us of that.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting concept, actually, and that is that unless stakeholders are included, and here I think in my own work, it's primarily parents, right? Unless parents are included in the community and fully included, and that has racial, language, and ethnic components to it, and also social components to it, they sometimes don't understand the fabric of the community. They can feel disrespected, they can feel excluded, they can feel that the system's loaded against them and therefore it's loaded against their children. And I think what we find quite often in schools is that a huge furore around a particular issue can quite often be a proxy for a whole lot of other issues that actually have been left unattended for a long time. And if one thinks back to that particular issue that you mentioned, Mike, the Pretoria Girls High hair issue back in, I think it was 2015 or 2016. To be frank, it was about hair, but it wasn't about hair. here was a proxy for a lack of inclusion, a lack of respect for differences within the community, a set of rules that were made for white girls that were imposed on black girls and Indian girls and colored girls. And it was a sense that, and I think many of our South African schools, and let's feel blessed here, we've got amazing schools in this country, not enough of them, but we have many of them. But many of them come with baggage from the apartheid era, which is, we include you, but you've got to play according to our rules. We include you, but you've got to have haircuts like our girls have, or our boys have, or our students have, etc. So I think in that context, whenever complaints come to management in schools, and certainly we apply that here, we say, okay, well, that's the complaint, but is there another complaint that isn't being articulated here? And do we need to explore a bit deeper as to whether we're dealing actually with the right problem, if you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, super. And I think once one gets into it, one's got to be, once the iceberg is exposed, be sure the water level's going to drop, and you're going to see more of the iceberg, and tackle that seriously, and not just try and close out on the hair issue. Tom, I touched on it earlier that sometimes third parties get involved in issues within organisations, be it of harassment or racism. We've seen it in business where outsiders will demand that immediate disciplinary action is taken against people. I think we had it in that Schweitzer Reneke school case. I suppose with schools are perhaps more so than businesses in the public domain and in the public space and visibility. But where you get demands from outsiders that you've now got to adopt a zero tolerance approach, and how quickly are you going to dismiss the person? Any suggestions on how leaders should respond to that type of pressure?
Well, that's a fabulous question, and actually I've just come through a process of that type myself over the last 2.5 months, and I think, again, because of the socialization that's happened in our society, there is a sense of justice should be punitive, as in, if something happens, we ask the question, what rules have been broken? In a restorative kind of context, we would say, well, what actually happened? And I think it goes back to getting the details. Tanya was talking about that just now. In a punitive system, it's who did it. In a restorative system, it's like, well, who has been harmed and how? And then a punitive system might also ask, well, what do they deserve? Because you're looking for punishment. You're looking for some sort of statement here. Whereas in actual fact, in a restorative system, one is asking, well, what needs to happen here so that we can make things as right as possible? And that means we fully understand we may not be able to fix everything perfectly. It's a bit like Humpty Dumpty on the wall. It may look like the egg has been put back on the wall, but it's not necessarily perfectly formed as it was. And if we adopt the restorative approach, even if there are third parties involved, the third parties might be able to understand that we need them to work with us and engage in a process that will take longer than the simple quick fit kind of thing. I've just been through that just now, where there was a member of my staff who was verbally abused in a public place, and we understood. Obviously, as a schools group, we've got campuses in different places, so therefore our footprint is fairly broad. But this happened in a public place, not on any of the campuses. And the first thing was to say, well, we're at the limits of our jurisdiction, but we think we may have a process or a method here that may help us to resolve this, because I have a personal interest in my member of staff feeling restored, if you know what I'm saying. And thankfully, the other party said, well, let me engage and see how it goes. And I'll be frank with you, it took the better part of 2 months of toing and froing to try and reach a conclusion. But part and parcel of that was speaking to the victim and putting the victim's perspective and perceptions first. And the question we asked in that case was, what needs to happen here to make this as right as possible for you? Can you help us to figure out what would be an appropriate outcome? And that became our roadmap as we went forward. And I think it's maybe easier when you're dealing with adults in a situation like that, because the adults can see the ambiguity sometimes and the fact that there's a degree of incomplete process at times, but we work towards it. And in that particular case, Mike, we we got to the end where both parties actually sat opposite each other. And Frank, I've been in education for 37, 38 years, both here and back in Ireland. And I have never seen a restorative process like that, because the other party did not understand the hurt, the pain, the humiliation, and the damage until it was articulated in the tears of the victim. Yeah. There's no way that could have been managed in a punitive process whatsoever. It required the restorative process. And I think more and more of that happening gives a sense of it may take time, but the outcome's worth it. So therefore, let's not try and put this on a clock, so we try and do it in a week or 2 weeks.
Yeah, super. And I think that being heard was so important in that context, allowing the person to voice and for them to be heard, and confirmation that they've been heard, particularly relevant. Tom, we're going to just move on to one last question. Mistakes do occur, and how leaders react to those and what public statements that they make will be particularly important. I don't know if you've got any kind of advice for leaders in these situations of what to do and what not to do.
Well, the first thing would be, if you write a memo or an email, don't send it today, send it tomorrow. Sleep on it, get up and have a look at it tomorrow. And if it still looks right to you, it's probably right. If it doesn't look right to you, change it and then send it. So responding to things on the spur of the moment, allowing your own emotions to become involved, sort of losing your neutral sense, because I think so many of our school leaders can get trapped up in you're criticizing my institution, my school, my group, therefore I respond personally as well. And I think in that situation, try and be neutral, try and be separate, try and make sure that you give your chances a chance to reflect. And secondly, and finally on this, I suppose, and that is that just get the facts. Every story has at least two sides to it. The first side you hear cannot be the only side of the story. And particularly in issues of harassment and bullying, you're probably needing to hear 2 or 3 perspectives on this. So don't respond to the first one. Make sure you give yourself time to engage with all parties, so you get a far more nuanced and broader and more detailed and granular understanding of what actually transpired.
Yeah, super. Yeah, thanks, Tom. Any questions to Tom? I think we've really emphasized that the value of having a really effective way of dealing with complaints and supporting the victims, and perhaps converting giving the perpetrator some Damascus experience is very, very important. Thanks, for that. Anybody like to throw out any questions to Tom before we move on to Mara? Okay, Tom, thanks very much. I think we are rushing it a bit, but we've got 20 minutes to go. So let's try and get through this last session. And I'm sure it's the start of many conversations to be had. So let's just put the footprint down. When we look at sexual harassment, the Code of Good Practice has been around for many, many years. It was under the Labour Relations Act, and then I think in 2005 the Employment Equity one came into play. Much of the framework of that existing code still applies, but the definition of sexual harassment has been expanded to cover same-sex harassment on the basis of sex, gender, sexual orientation, or gender-based, harassment. That comment that, or the point that Tanya raised, because we are dealing with misconduct. Should the person have known or ought to have known? Did the person know or ought to have known? And then the nature of sexual harassment includes some additional items: stalking, behavior, suggestions, messages, advances, attention, proposals of a sexual nature, and also threats to comply. And then the overriding consideration is what impact on the individual, the victim, the complainant, and to what extent is it the approach or the conduct, whether verbal or physical, has had on is it offensive to the complainant? And I think Mara will actually touch on that. Mara, before we kick off, perhaps you can just expand a bit more the work that you do at Tears.
Tears Foundation helps people in distress. Essentially, we deal with victims of abuse, which could be harassment of any kind, be it sexual, bullying, whatever, and it could be as far apart as financial harassment, being locked out of their house, being kicked out of their house, which often happens. So basically, it's any form of trauma.
Yeah, and do you refer people to other service providers, or is it a service that the Tears Foundation is able to do themselves?
We have an amazing team of people in our office. We've got 8 counsellors, but what they are is referral specialists, and then we do other tasks like go to court with people, help them get protection orders, accompany, find them, we will call around till we find a place of safety. So our services are all in the support field, but we don't do direct counselling. So when someone comes to us for help, we try to help them find the solution, and we contain the situation, because counselling should be a long-term relationship, and normally takes 3 or 4, 5 sessions. Because we deal with so many thousands of calls, we'd rather refer them to a Lifeline or SADAG or some of Rape Crisis in Cape Town. One of the things I need to say about working in the field of rape, gender-based violence and abuse, is that we have to all work together. It's not like being in a business where people are in competition. We have to work together. There are not enough of us out there helping people.
Yeah, super. And I think for it's an important link that you're highlighting there, that by working with you, you can find the appropriate support system for the and process for the victim. Now, Tom mentioned the long-term scars of bullying and harassment. Sexual harassment is a lot more invasive of an individual and a victim. And just some thoughts that you have of the pain and the difficulties that people carry that have been exposed to sexual harassment incidents?
Well, the sad part is you actually never recover from it. And I think that's a very hard thing to understand. It's always with you. So we try to encourage people or put them in situations. And as a survivor, I understand very much what is needed. And we try to put them in situations where they as a person feel safe and they are loved and cared for, and they grow bigger. So in other words, the pain doesn't diminish, but you need to grow bigger as a person. And a lot of the difficulty of what we have is when a person's been through a traumatic situation, for example, being bullied in the workplace, even if the matter is resolved, it's very, very hard to gain your self-worth back. And so the journey to recovery, whether it's bullying, sexual abuse, rape, intimate partner violence, whatever it is a very hard journey. And so what we do is we walk the journey with people. It is very hard to recover and learn to be positive about life again, and understand that nobody else is going to take charge of your life. You are responsible for your own healing.
Yeah, and I think what you're emphasizing here is on the one hand, to create a safe workplace, particularly for vulnerable people, but also as part of the awareness programs, is to highlight the long-term scars that sexual harassment inevitably carry. And it's really building up understanding and getting people to understand the rationale, why it is not acceptable. And I mean, there have been cases where the person said, I was just trying my luck. Well, you don't do that either. And
but interestingly, what I do is when people do come to me about sexual harassment in the workplace, is I say, get a notebook and note the stuff. Because I think one has to be even-handed when dealing with the case. She might be I'm not saying the victim is ever to blame, but what I am saying is she might be a participant in the jokes and doesn't like it when it's put on her end. So I always say keep a diary so that when you go to report the matter, you can say this has happened 15 times in the last month, because it's about how you feel, because we've dealt with the law, we've dealt with Tom, the logical, and then I deal with emotions. And so it's how you feel. But however, sometimes it could be a feeling you feel because of your past life. So one needs to be sure that you're dealing with the real issue, as was so correctly mentioned by Tom earlier, that sometimes that person feels that she's been harassed, but she was bypassed for a promotion.
Yeah, and I think just touching on that issue of promotions and stuff, to what extent does power or abuse of power be experienced in relation to sexual harassment issues?
It's probably one of the biggest drivers in the workplace, and it isn't always sexual abuse. It could be a person who shouts all the time. That's an abusive situation. So part of it could lie with the fact that we promote somebody to a position on the Peters principle. So we need to be sure of what we as employers, the role that we play in formulating the workplace environment so it's safe, well run, but properly run. It can't be your best rep becomes the sales manager. Your best rep needs to be the best sales manager. So it's very, very confusing in the workplace. So sexual abuse does happen with snarky jokes, but it happens right across the spectrum. I've dealt with cases, for example, a person who was dismissed from their job from a very big international computer company because they wanted the supervisor wanted a promotion, and if he left, he'd get the promotion. So I loved what Tom said, that we have to understand the motivation for the situation. Mostly it's just self-gratification and pure bad behavior, but there can often be a hidden agenda, and it's very, very important to find that out in the resolution of the situation.
Yeah, super. And I think that if one's looking at employers doing risk analysis, the power play comes into recruitment and promotions and perhaps other favors in the workplace, and one needs to make sure that those are all done on a merit basis. One of the elements of sexual harassment is unwanted, and what guidance can you suggest to help victims to appreciate and have the confidence to report it and say that's not on? Is there a simple formula that you can describe to say it's more than just a joke, or when it does become crosses the line? What's a little simple test there?
Well, my yardstick is very simple. If it doesn't make you feel good, it's not good. If you're not enjoying the interaction, you need to have a look. And so one doesn't want to be running to personnel every 5 minutes and reporting that so-and-so's made a sexist joke. But however, one does have to protect, because quite often a person who abuses one person will be abusing other people. It's not an isolated incident. So it's very good to have a handbook where people know exactly what it is. And if there is a supervisor in your division and that they're picking on you, you need to say, this is not allowed. I am going to report you if you do it again, and start recording it on the phone. So we have modern technology today. And so that's why I said we write it in a book or we record it on our phone, because just like rape without semen as evidence is very hard to prove. Abuse is very hard to prove if it's verbal in an office, if you don't have evidence, because unfortunately that person will be picking on everybody else as well. And people are bystanders, they are not participators or supporters. And most people won't come forward for fear of losing their position.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on that the helping people to be able to articulate the harassment by keeping notes, and that's absolutely super. And one of the factors, or one of the points in the existing code of good practice, is that your first line of reference in reporting a situation of sexual harassment is not a line manager, but somebody else who has gravitas in the organization. And what can that person do to make it easy for people to report?
I think it's very difficult to report if the person to whom you are reporting is not of a senior enough level. So I guess what I'm saying is that we need to view the interactions with the responsible person for any kind of abuse reporting. They need to be of a high level. It needs to be confidential. It mustn't be in a general place where everybody knows. And very importantly, you need to be deeply empathetic with this person, because it's a fearful thing going and reporting something where your heart and your inner being has been hurt. And it's fearful, and they fear rejection. So you need to be warm and caring, and you need to take notes, and you're empathetic. And if you're going to do something and you promise them, I will discuss this and I'll come back to you on this date, you need to stick to your word, because generally speaking, the complaints we get, and we get hundreds, are because the harassment has been reported to a lower level person, and I'm not saying the line manager, a lower level person who's been a personnel clerk who has been tasked, mandated to do it. And I'm actually saying, I don't think unless that person is trained, it's suitable. It needs to be treated with the due anguish that that person is feeling, so that they see that you view this as an important matter.
Yeah, and I think just in combining with some of the things that Tom mentioned there, it's not for the point of reference to judge at this stage. It's saying you've gone through a situation, you've got your feelings, you've got your hurt. You know, we're here to help. We believe in you, and we're here to support you. As Tom indicated also, there's probably more than one side to the story, and due investigations have got to take place, etc. But it is important that the person comes away and it says, at least I've been heard, and I know that there is help and support, available. Any other sort of thoughts, Maura? And I'm kind of just thinking on time. I mean, this whole issue of detecting it and having it reported is so important, because without that you can't do the healing process. But just any other important practical steps in investigating complaints?
Well, I think it's very important to look at the situation with that particular employee. Has he or she suddenly become tardy, coming to work looking shabby, getting numerous phone calls that they didn't get before, doing crying in the office? So behavioral change is very important, because they might be being abused at home. And so when you are being abused in your own home, and we spoke earlier about that, suddenly it's in your workplace is now your home. So a key thing there is intimate partner violence, which is called IPV, is the most dominant situation in our country at the moment. So I guess what I'm saying, because we're running down now, is that it's very important to notice. And guys that are watching me, I know sometimes we don't always notice those things, so maybe get your secretary to walk around the office and see if people will attract her, because this is not about a power struggle. This is about people's lives. I've had 5 deaths in the last 2 weeks in my people we've been counselling, unnatural deaths. And that is so heartbreaking, and it could be tomorrow that one was a little girl who was being abused by his stepdad, only 17, and committed suicide. So it's on our doorstep. We are a very depressed country. Coronavirus has affected us terribly. So I'm saying, if you see something is amiss, we are here for you. We offer free service, a corporate sponsor us, and we want to help. So I hope that you'll have our numbers. So if any of your staff want to get help, we're available.
Yeah. So I think you've really highlighted for us, and it's a very sensitive topic, a far more sensitive topic than bullying. What one is wanting to do is to create the climate where people feel comfortable in reporting it, but not all people will. And I think the point that you've just made here, employers can be proactive here and look at behavioral changes in individuals I think one of the points we discussed previously is how does an abusive partner gain power over a victim? And one of them is they control income. And just an interesting thing from an employer perspective, when a new employee fills in a form, where does my salary go to? Whose account is that going into? And there's perhaps a signal here. Why is it going into your partner's bank account and not yours? It could be a potential leverage for abuse at a later time, so very important to note that.
That's an invaluable point,
Yeah,
Mark. You know,
yeah.
one of the first things I do when I help women to leave an abusive relationship is I make sure they've got all their documents and I help them to open a bank account. So I think that should be part of your service at an organization. If they haven't got a bank account, help them to open one.
Yeah, super. Mara, I think you've spoken so deeply and with passion and with lots of experience of helping other people. And thank you for the work that you are doing. And to I think all the participants in the webinar, Mara is a resource out there, an experienced one, and can really be of huge assistance, in this regard. There's so many questions that we could have asked and carried on the conversation for a much further time, but we have got to the bewitching hour of 1:30. But I think before we just close off, any concluding comments? Anybody would like to make a comment on how they found the session, what perhaps they found most valuable, what you would like us to do, pursuant to this? Anybody like to make a comment or chip in here?
I see Linda has made a comment in the chat box, Mike. She says, thank you very much. This has been a very insightful discussion. She has to leave, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay.
There's some more typing for the comments. Hold on a second for me, please. Again, a watch pot doesn't boil. From Lizelle saying, thank you for a very informative discussion and some good points to ponder on as an employer. Sherry says, excellent session, very informative and pertinent.
Yeah, super. And I think just a concluding aspect that employment law perhaps does default to discipline. And Tom talked about that restorative justice approach. I'm not sure that it's valid in all, probably more prevalent, or its use could be more powerful with bullying, etc. I think with sexual harassment, there are times when it's a step too far. But in minor incidents of sexual harassment, it could be a very powerful tool to look at. In addition to discipline, I think it's probably a combination there. And so, thank you very much indeed to Tanya. She has left us. And Mara, to you, and best wishes going forward with all the work that you are doing. It's astounding the number of referrals that you do deal with, and you have become a lighthouse in society. And I would hope, excuse me, that this revised code will stretch into the formal sector of employment. And there's something like 7.5 million employees. And if we extrapolate that, they've all got 4 dependents. Good messages by the employers could actually reach half the population. And perhaps in this way, and using this code in a positive way, we can actually make a change in our society. So thank you for your ideas, your input, and the work that you're all doing. Well done. And to the participants, thank you so much for being with us today. Annika, thank you for setting this up. And bye to everybody. Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you, Mike.
Yes.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Laura. Thank you, Tom.
Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Cheers, Tom.
Bye-bye.